Q Who. This is the first episode that introduces the Borg to the Star Trek franchise. And I've always loved this episode. This episode made a big impression on me when I was a kid. I remember seeing this episode probably around 1994 or 95, and I was a kid, probably about 10 years old, and I remember seeing this and just being blown away that this was an awesome, awesome Star Trek episode. A little backstory about how I first came to see this episode. I remember back in the day, in the early 90s, obviously you didn't have YouTube or Netflix or Paramount or any way to really watch this show. And I had an old Star Trek encyclopedia, I think it was called, and it was a book, and it showed the breakdown of like the Enterprise, but it also had a list of all the episodes in order of when they came out. And I was watching these when they came out on reruns on TV, and I was looking at the Star Trek encyclopedia, and I found out, what episode I was on, and then in a few more episodes, I was trying to time it so I knew what day to tune in, because when they had this show come on, it came on late at night. My parents wouldn't let me watch it. It was like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and I was trying to find out when it came on so that I could throw in a VHS tape and record this. So anyway, I remember going to sleep, and I told my mom, wake me up or throw in a tape, when this episode is when it comes on. And she like came into the room and told me, "Oh, this episode it is on." And I ran out into the living room where we had the TV, and I threw in the VHS tape, and I got there just in the nick of time. I only missed like a couple minutes of the starting part of the episode, and I was able to record this episode. And I must have watched this 100 times, when I was a kid. So this episode is great, and I'm going to go into a breakdown of all the little things that I like about this episode. Okay, so this episode kicks off with Ensign Sonia Gomez, and she's at the replicator, and she's ordering a hot chocolate. She is a recent Academy graduate. She obviously graduated with top grades, top honors, whatever you got to do to get the Federation flagship, and she's all excited about it. She wants to tell anybody that can listen about that. She wants to tell Geordi about that, and she goes into this explanation about, the things that she's studied and done phase work with antimatter, and, everybody wants the Enterprise. Um, and Geordi has to interject and say, "Hey, Ensign Sonia, don't you think you might want to get away from the control stations with that hot chocolate?" And she's like, "Yeah, yeah, that would be a good idea. I'm going to go drink it over here." And as she goes to turn around, who's coming? But who's coming around the corner but Captain Picard, and she just drills him with the hot chocolate. So she's trying to make good first impressions, and she drills the captain of the ship with the hot chocolate, and it's all over him, and she's trying to kind of wipe it up, but obviously she can't. Um, so that's a fun scene, and Geordi says, "I give you this. It's a meeting the captain won't soon forget," and she's basically devastated that happened. So it's funny. Okay, so Picard is drilled with a hot chocolate. He has to go back to his quarters and change because Ensign Sonia Gomez just drilled him with the hot chocolate, so he has to go back and change his clothes. So on his way back in the turbo lift door opens and Picard is on a shuttlecraft. And who turns around on the shuttlecraft to look at him? No one other than Q, the arch nemesis of the Enterprise crew that's been seen in a few episodes so far. So Q turns around and Picard is going to find out what Q wants. The next scene we see Guinan in 10 Forward, and Guinan is a relatively new character in the series. We don't know a lot about Guinan, but she has this spider sense that something's not right on the ship. So she calls up to the bridge and speaks to Riker. And she asks, "Is everything all right up there?" And he says, "Yep, looks like everything is fine." So she says, "Well, maybe it's a false alarm and just forget that I called." So she just goes back to doing what she was doing. And suddenly, Counselor Troy walks onto the bridge in a rushed fashion and asks Riker, "Where's the captain?" And he says, "The captain's in his quarters." And then she tries to call the captain on the comm, and he doesn't answer. So immediately the Enterprise crew know that something's wrong. The captain's not here, and they start searching for the captain. So the Enterprise is looking for the captain. They are searching, they're going in circles and increasing their search, but they can't seem to locate the captain. Meanwhile, the captain is in the shuttlecraft with Q, and Q is talking about, hear me out, what I want to tell you. And Picard's like, "I don't want to listen. You said you would leave us alone. I don't want to listen." And Picard's like, "Yeah, I don't want to listen." Well, Q says, "You will listen in time. I can stay out here forever, and I'm ageless. You age, Picard, so you better hear me out." And then Q is hitting the ball against the wall of the shuttlecraft, and then Picard says, "Yeah, I guess I can listen to you," or he just nods his head, and then suddenly, boom, they're back on the Enterprise, back in 10 Forward. And Riker gets notified from Worf that, the captain is back and he's in 10 Forward. So they are going to go down to check out what's going on down there. And Guinan pops out from underneath the bar, and she sees that it's Q, and she gets into this weird cat pose fighting stance to fight off Q or do whatever she can do, because we don't know a lot about Guinan up until this point, but she obviously knows Q and they've had dealings, she says. Okay, so Q has returned Picard to the Enterprise, and he's in 10 Forward, and Q is talking about how he should be a member of the Enterprise's crew because he can share insight into the unexplored sections of space that they don't know about. And Picard says, "No, we need to be able to do this ourselves. We don't trust you." Q insists that his knowledge is critical for them. And Picard says, "We're resolute, we're determined, and your help is not required." And Q snaps his fingers and flings the Enterprise into an unexplored section of space. And the line from Q, John Delancey, is great, where he says, "The hall is rented, the orchestra engaged. It's now time to see if you can dance." And he's now put them up against the Borg for the first time. Okay, so the Enterprise crew now being in an uncharted area of space, which Data says from the bridge it would take them 2 years, 7 months, 3 days, 18 hours to reach the nearest starbase. So that is very far away, and they are in this unexplored section of space. So Picard has a choice. He can turn around and go back, which Guinan warned him he should do. He should turn around. But Picard insists, you know what? Let's go and explore this unexplored section of the galaxy before we head back. So the Enterprise is out moving about in this new section of space where they detect an unknown vessel that is probing them. And they see the vessel move in, and it's strange. It's a cube-shaped craft. It doesn't look like anything they've encountered before, and they don't see any life signs. The Enterprise puts up their shields after being warned by Guinan. "Protect yourself, Captain, or they'll destroy you," she says. And we see a Borg beam right onto the ship in engineering and totally bypass the shields. They go right through them, and they are able to beam in. Okay, so a Borg beams into main engineering and is looking at all the controls and all the monitors and looking at the specs of the Enterprise. Picard comes down with a security team and is trying to make first contact with this new alien race that they've just encountered. What I always thought was funny about this scene is that Picard, the captain of the ship, is just standing there next to a potentially hostile species. He should know that they're hostile already because Q says that, he's warning them about them, and so Picard should be careful to stand that close to a dangerous hostile species, but he just stands there anyway and is trying to make first contact. So he tries to talk to the Borg drone, and of course the Borg drone ignores him. He doesn't care about him and starts trying to control the Enterprise or get information from the Enterprise. He's doing something that he shouldn't be doing, and Picard tells him to stop, and he doesn't listen. So a security officer walks over, but the security officer is immediately just thrown across the room, and then Picard tells Worf, Mr. Worf, use whatever means to neutralize the invader. And I just love that because it's a fancy way of saying just shoot the bad guy right there, but Picard dresses it up in a much more, or says it in a much fancier way, which I think is funny. But so they shoot the Borg. Nothing happens the first time they shoot him, and then they shoot him a second time with the phaser on maximum, and then finally it takes down the Borg. But as soon as they do that, another Borg beams in, and he's just finishing the work of the first Borg that beamed in. And then they try to use their phaser again, and the Borg is already adapted, so it doesn't work. And then the Borg takes away some, or takes off some components of the injured Borg drone and beams off the ship. And the Enterprise crew of Picard and the security people and Geordi just kind of look stunned. The crew are now in the observation lounge when suddenly they get a call from the bridge that says the Borg have locked onto them with a tractor beam. They rush onto the bridge and fight off the Borg attack after Picard orders Worf to ratchet the phasers up to maximum. And they find out that they've dealt damage to approximately 20% of the Borg vessel. Back in the observation lounge, Q tells the Enterprise's crew that the Borg is the ultimate user. They're unlike any threat your Federation has ever faced. They're not interested in political conquest, wealth, or power as you know it. They're simply interested in your ship, its technology. They've identified it as something they can consume. Riker suggests to the captain that if they're going to have any further dealings with the Borg, they should beam over to the vessel and see and learn everything that they can about the Borg. So Picard agrees, and Riker, Data, and Worf beam over. Now, one of the things I wanted to comment about this is that when they're on the Borg ship, you just look at how creepy this is. I mean, you're on a huge alien ship that they say the dimensions of the Borg ship, each side of it is 3 kilometers long. And so that is one massive ship. And just the way that the Borg look, they're creepy, man. Okay, so the Enterprise are walking around, they're exploring the different parts of the Borg ship, and they come across what appears to be the Borg nursery. So they look around a bit, and Data calls Riker over and says that the Borg appear to be regenerating, and that is why they haven't been paying attention to them. Their collective focus has been to repair the ship. Riker calls over to Picard, and Picard immediately snaps to action and says, "Let's get the hell out of here. Warp 8 now, Mr. Crusher. Engage." And they hightail it out of town. Okay, so the Enterprise hightails it out of there, and Picard calls down to Geordi in engineering, and he says, "Mr. LaForge, I want maximum warp for as long as we can hold it." And Geordi immediately puts it right to the red line and takes off with the Borg in hot pursuit. The Enterprise fires photon torpedoes trying to slow the Borg ship down, but it has no effect. The Borg have already regenerated. The Borg fire their energy weapons at the Enterprise, draining the shields and bringing the Enterprise down to impulse speed. Picard sits there in deep contemplation as Q says, "Picard, do you still profess to be prepared for what awaits you?" So, with no options left, the Enterprise decides to fire photon torpedoes, knowing that there's a good chance that the photons could destroy the Enterprise when Q says, "I'll be leaving now. You thought you could handle it, so handle it." And Picard finally says to Q, he says, "Q, end this." Q snaps his fingers and sends the Enterprise back to where they started. The last scene of the episode wraps up the episode with Picard and Guinan sitting there playing chess. And Guinan says that the Borg are now aware of their presence. And Picard has us pause and he says, "They will be coming." And Guinan responds back and says, "You can bet on it." So this is obviously setting up another encounter with the Borg in the future. And the episode ends.